Hello and welcome to today's Inside Energy and Utilities podcast. In today's episode, we're going to look at the news stories over the last week that grabbed my interest, and that's the week ending in the 12th of July. And I'm going to talk about the stories that grabbed my interest. This is by no means comprehensive, but these are the stories that stood out for me. Interested to know if you find any stories that I really should have discussed that I haven't. Please do get in touch. But let me start by talking about the first story that grabbed my interest. And so this is now probably a slightly old article. Actually, it comes from the BBC, which says Sunak to unveil £2 billion home insulation scheme. And it states hundreds of thousands of homeowners will receive vouchers of up to £5,000 for energy-saving home improvements, with the poorest getting up to £10,000. And the Treasury said these grants could help support more than 100,000 jobs. So very interesting. So first thing to say, yes, this is a very welcome move by the government. For me, there's an interest. I've worked in this space for the last 15 years, if you like. I don't actually at the moment, but I've worked with a number of energy companies on something called the energy company obligation. And essentially, that's a scheme that puts an obligation on energy companies to ensure that they fund and administer the installation of energy efficiency measures in households. And so for me, I've got a big interest, and there's two big interests. One is the sort of 50,000 view strategic level, and one is the sort of detail level. And the detail level is, how is this going to work? When the biggest sort of pot of money for retrofit funding comes from the energy company obligation that I've just mentioned. So for me, it's going to be interesting to see from what I'm reading, and this was sort of very much an early article, and I think a lot of the detail will come out at a later stage. But from what I'm reading, is this is not administered by energy suppliers. This seems to be run by government. Again, that might change, or I might have missed something. But when this came out last week, that wasn't very clear. So for me, that is interesting. And then, the interesting part is, how do you claim? For those firms that install it, what accreditation do they need to have? Again, if you work in the energy company obligation / Green Deal space, you have some accreditation called past 2030. How will that work on this scheme, and how long will it run for? The other part is very much the high level view, to say, as a society, we're transitioning to net zero. We're looking at the COVID-19 green recovery. How does this fit into the wider picture of things, and what is the strategic picture here? Because energy efficiency and reducing our consumption is a big part of getting to net zero, but you get into a lot of complicated questions, such as single measures versus whole house retrofit, and then the cost of whole house retrofit. And then a lot of homes have already been insulated and have a lot of basic energy efficiency measures installed under previous funding regimes. And really, we need to start looking at the hard to treat homes, which are your solid wall properties, which you can't easily insulate, and the cost of making them much more energy efficient is also much more expensive. So for me, it's a very welcome move, but it's a very interesting move, and to see what is the sort of strategic picture here. So that's the first story. The second story actually fits in with sort of two stories, but it comes from Storage.news, and basically says batteries cost-effective alternative to fossil fuels. UK grid operator flexibility project finds. So the conclusion wasn't sort of interest to me, because obviously I think most of us are probably aware of the potential of battery technology, and that it's cost effective, and that it's got a very big sort of role to play in the journey to net zero. So the article goes on to say batteries can offer a cost-effective option for upward and downward reserve to the UK grid, a project run by AI and automation tech firm Aramco with transmission network operator National Grid ESO has found. The trial, first announced in May, found that the Electricity National Control Centre can effectively request the availability of sustained upward and downward reserve using a new operational agreement. As such, batteries offer a real alternative to thermal power plants and combined cycle gas turbines in particular. So what for me was interesting to see here wasn't the conclusion. As I said, what for me really is interesting here is to see a trial and where they use Arenco, which is a firm that uses automation and AI. And so for me, the interest here is really the emergence of AI in energy. I think we will see a lot more in the coming years and very much in the coming months, I suppose. I think AI is going to be very, very dominant within energy, obviously in a lot of spaces, but in energy, particularly when you look at a flexible grid and that kind of thing. And again, the bigger picture is when we look at the journey to net zero, we look at a lot of niche technologies and renewables, obviously, but for me, AI has a very big role to play in that as well, and so it's very interesting to see what does that mean, and how do we control, how do we monitor and regulate for the use of AI and everything that entails. So that was a very interesting one, and again, on that theme, the sort of article that I grabbed my interest the day after was this one from currentnews.co.uk, which says enhanced data is a critical prerequisite for the energy transition, says Kwarteng, and that's obviously Energy Minister Kwarteng. So the article goes on to state, Energy Minister Kwarteng has said that energy data will be critical to the transition to a net zero economy. In response to a letter sent to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson in June by a collection of businesses, tech companies and universities, Kwarteng has highlighted the importance of energy data for decarbonisation. So that probably actually sort of backs up the argument that I mentioned about AI and net zero. But yes, I completely I can't agree more with Kwarteng here. I think he goes on to state that the future energy system will be a data-driven energy system. Absolutely. For me, again, linked to the previous news article, the use of AI and how commonplace that will become, and how that allows for the optimal running of the energy system and the decentralized energy system. Yes, again, 100% agree. I think what's interesting is the implications of this, and obviously we see this already. We see in energy the opening up of energy data and what that will do. I think we all know that the data is absolutely essential. For me, it's the implication of yes, data is essential. We're opening up data. What does that mean? Obviously, we've got the transition from network operators to system operators, i.e. managing flows and having much more data engineering capability. And so for me, the implications are very different skill sets, very different ways of managing the energy grid of the future than the energy grid of today. Upskilling of existing staff, what are the skills gaps that you've got at the moment, and then AI and the emergence in energy and then how data will enable that. So yeah, absolutely, I completely agree. Enhanced data is a critical prerequisite for the energy transition, 100%, and it will be very interesting to see what the future holds for the in regards to data and energy. But yes, I don't think anyone would doubt Kwarteng's observation here. The fourth article that grabbed my attention was from Reuters, which states UN chief urges end to coal financing to spur the clean energy shift. Interesting, a very interesting article for me here. So there's a few things that I found very interesting here. So Let's get to the article. So, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres urged countries on Thursday to stop financing coal and pledge not to build new coal-fired power plants to enable a shift to clean energy. So he spoke at a virtual clean energy transition summit of 40 countries representing 80% of energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. And they discussed steps to buoy economies, cut emissions, and make energy systems more resilient to climate change. Yeah, this was just a staggering article for me. So, yeah, where do I begin? So one of the sort of things in this article that really grabbed my attention was, and it's a completely staggering statistic, it states that it talks about China moving to a more cleaner way of doing things and being very much committed to that. And I think, we have to sort of applaud that. But the other staggering statistic that in this article is it stated that China has more coal-fired power under development than the entire US coal capacity at the moment, 250 gigawatts, which is just staggering if you think all of that coal will come onto the Chinese grid in the next few years. So for me, what is interesting is that this is talked about and sort of UN level and how much the focus is on the clean energy shift. So that was a first. The other thing that I sort of picked out was that I think UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also said that the business case for renewables is better than coal. And so again, pardon the pun, but if we look at the sort of coal phase of the first energy transition away from coal, you can now clearly see that for investors, renewables are more attractive than coal. And I think within that, we can also see that with the energy transition that we will start seeing the same thing with other fossil fuels, and that the business case for renewables is going to get stronger and stronger as the years go by. And then when we're talking about years, we're literally talking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, not in decades. And it also shows me here that there's a lot going on globally that obviously various countries can't control, and it shows me the importance of dialogue and discussion, and obviously COP26, the climate change conference, which has been postponed this year to next year due to the coronavirus. But it does show me that the energy transition is very much a global transition. I suppose there's no surprise in that, but I think we sometimes lose sight of that when, particularly wherever you work. I work in the UK, so I'm very much focused on UK politics. I have a little global look here and there, but obviously this is very much a global drive. And so for me, the importance of things like COP26 and having that global discussion, I think, are absolutely essential. And then the final article comes from The Guardian, which says, from dusted off bikes to electric dreams, the UK green economy booms on back of COVID-19. Pandemic accelerates development in sustainability from businesses and consumers. I did not like this article at all. I don't know. I just didn't take to it at all. But I completely agree with the sentiment. I think one of the quotes in there comes. Let me have a look. Comes from Stephen Jennings, a partner at global advisory firm PwC, and he says one of the unintended consequences of the coronavirus crisis is the opportunity for businesses to think about the future. If a company has to rebuild itself, it makes sense to reconfigure how it works to be more sustainable. And I do fully agree with that. I think COVID-19 has been a bit of a pause button and almost reset button. And we know that the economy has been hit hard and that it will be hit harder as this unfolds, unfortunately. And that picture doesn't look very pretty. I think what has been interesting is that instead of what we've seen with the previous crisis in 2008, the big financial crisis, when I worked when I looked at sort of sustainability, the big focus shifted away from sustainability to economic recovery. It seems that COVID-19 has almost done the opposite. It allowed us to sort of pause and question uh, really, and how do we operate in this world, and what is important. And it seems to have been a rallying cry from and every sector of society, using this as a way to become to look at the future and become more sustainable. And instead of economic recovery, we're talking about green recovery and sustainability sort of at the heart. So even though I didn't like the article, I fully agreed with the sort of sentiment of it, and I agree that COVID-19 has become a rallying cry to do things different, really. It will be interesting to see how that sort of pans out in the next 9 to 12 months. But yeah, I can completely agree with the article, even though I didn't like it. And I think that those were the 5 main stories from the last week that really grabbed my attention. Let me know what you think of some of these stories, and yes, very keen to hear your feedback if there were any news stories that I really missed. I hope that was useful. If you do want to get in touch, please do so via LinkedIn or Twitter at @SepVanDort. Thank you very much for listening.